In the dimly lit streets of early modern Geneva, the air was thick with the scent of rain and the whispers of the past. The city, a bastion of Protestantism, was a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the secular were often blurred. But one night, the silence was shattered by a cry that echoed through the narrow alleys, a cry that spoke of a soul in turmoil. In a small, sparsely furnished room, a man lay on the floor, his eyes wide open, lifeless. He was one of the 150 suicides in Geneva during that period. His life cut short by the demons of his mind. The average age of those who took their own lives was 43.6 years, a stark reminder that the pain of existence could strike at any time. The man described as alienated had been 43.6 when he made his final decision. The melancholic, on the other hand, were slightly younger at 43.2, but the difference was negligible. Both groups shared a common thread of despair. The city's records, meticulously kept, revealed that 12 of these 150 cases had missing age data. 9 of these 12 suicides occurred before 1750, a time when the city was still grappling with the high mortality rates that were common in the early modern period. Despite the frequent loss of parents, the suicide rates in Geneva remained low throughout the late 17th century. It wasn't until the late 18th century, when life expectancy began to increase, that the number of self-inflicted deaths started to rise. Some psychological theories suggested that a decline in mortality could lead to a drop in the suicide rate. Disrupted relationships in childhood, especially the mother-child bond, were thought to increase the risk of suicide later in life. However, these theories didn't apply to early modern Geneva. The city's high mortality rates and the common occurrence of children losing parents did not correlate with the low suicide rates. It was a paradox that puzzled scholars and historians. The city's deep-rooted Calvinist beliefs played a significant role in shaping the attitudes towards suicide. Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, was often seen as more receptive to the scientific discoveries of the time. Yet the religious and moral framework of the city was complex. Even during the Revolutionary period, the new Constitution of 1794 explicitly forbade the practice of any religion other than Protestantism. The Genevan revolutionaries, unlike their French counterparts, were not anti-clerical. Several pastors even supported the democratic movement, blending religious and political ideals. The role of religion in shaping the city's identity was evident in the way it influenced the perception of death and the afterlife. The devil, once a central figure in religious discourse, began to fade from the collective consciousness by the end of the 18th century. This shift was reflected in the literature of the time, where the devil often appeared in a more nuanced and less fearsome form. For instance, in Goethe's Faust, Mephistopheles was a complex character, far removed from the traditional image of the personification of evil. The changing attitudes toward the devil and the afterlife were also evident in the city's legal and social practices. In 1707, a citizen named André Robert Faudney faced the consistory and the small council for his deistic beliefs. He was banished from the city for questioning the divinity of Jesus and the existence of hell. This incident highlighted the tension between religious orthodoxy and the emerging rationalist thinking of the Enlightenment. The city's liturgy, which once warned of the devil's potential to seize the souls of the dying, had evolved by the 18th century. Official prayers now focused on God's healing and the promise of eternal paradise, with no mention of the devil. This shift reflected a broader trend toward a more humanistic and less fear-driven approach to religion. The city's intellectual and cultural landscape was also changing. The Academy of Geneva, once a bastion of reformed scholasticism, began to embrace new ideas. Jean-Alphonse Turretin, a prominent figure at the Academy, advocated for the reform and promotion of studies, reflecting the city's gradual transition toward Enlightenment values. Despite these changes, the city's leaders and institutions remained deeply religious, often subjecting new appointments to confirmation by the small council. The city's history was a tapestry of religious, political, and social changes, each thread contributing to the complex fabric of Genevan life. The paradox of high mortality rates and low suicide rates, the evolving role of religion, and the gradual shift toward a more rational and humanistic worldview all painted a picture of a city in transition. Geneva, a place where the sacred and the secular coexisted, was a microcosm of the broader changes sweeping through Europe during the early modern period. In the silence of that dark night, the city's past and present intertwined, a reminder that the human soul is a fragile and complex entity, shaped by the forces of history, religion, and the ever-changing tides of society. In the late 1700s, Geneva, a small city in Switzerland, faced a strange and troubling phenomenon, a dramatic rise in suicides. This wasn't just a blip on the radar. It was a significant change that lasted well into the early 1800s. To understand this, we need to look at what was happening in Geneva and how people's attitudes toward suicide were changing. One of the most striking cases involved Suzanne Lesage, a 48-year-old woman who was the divorced wife of André Chateau. In February 1778, Suzanne jumped from her fourth-floor window to her death. She had been feeling very uneasy for a while, crying a lot, and having trouble sleeping. Her brother said that on the day she died, she cried out, "I have Satan in my body." The city's leaders, the small council, simply ordered that she be buried without any religious prayers. This was a stark contrast to earlier times when the devil and religious fears played a much bigger role in such tragedies. Geneva was a city where ideas were changing rapidly. Lawyers, for example, were reading a lot more about science, philosophy, and natural law. Theological books, which used to be a big part of their libraries, were becoming less common. Pierre Faycheau, a man who led a rebellion in 1707, had 615 books, and only 15% of them were about religion. This shows that people were becoming more interested in new ideas and less focused on traditional religious beliefs. Jean-Étienne Léotard was a wealthy man, married with young children. He and his wife had 3 live-in servants, and when he died, his belongings were worth a lot of money. Despite his wealth, he still faced personal struggles that led to his death. This case highlights that even the rich and successful were not immune to the pressures that could lead to suicide. Jean-Robert Tronchin, a prominent figure in Geneva, was deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and David Hume. He owned many of their books, including some that discussed controversial topics like suicide. Tronchin's interest in these ideas suggests that the Enlightenment was not just a set of abstract concepts, but was deeply ingrained in the lives of Genevans. By the late 1700s, the books people read in Geneva had changed dramatically. While in the early 1700s, they might have read works by Calvin and La Fontaine, by the end of the century, they were more likely to read books by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Rousseau's works, such as Émile and The Social Contract, were especially popular. This shift in reading habits reflects a broader change in the way people thought about life, society, and even death. Mental and physical illnesses were a common reason for suicides, especially among women. In the late 1700s, about 75.8% of the women who took their lives were dealing with these issues. For men, the figure was lower, at 44.4%. This shows that while men and women both faced significant challenges, women were particularly vulnerable to the effects of illness on their mental health. Despite the growing number of suicides, Geneva was not a large industrial city. It had a population of about 13,100 at the start of the 18th century and grew to around 29,000 by 1790. This growth was not as rapid as in many modern cities, and Geneva did not experience the kind of industrialization seen in other parts of Europe. This suggests that the increase in suicides was not due to the stress of urban or industrial life, but to other factors, such as changes in religious beliefs and the spread of new ideas. Modern psychiatrists might look at the biochemical factors behind suicide, such as low levels of serotonin, a chemical in the brain that affects mood. While this can help explain why some people who are depressed might be more likely to attempt suicide, it doesn't fully explain the dramatic increase in suicides in Geneva. It's unlikely that a sudden drop in serotonin levels affected so many people in such a short time. To understand the rise in suicides in Geneva, we need to consider the cultural and psychological changes happening at the time. The decline of religious fear, the spread of Enlightenment ideas, and the growing awareness of mental health issues all played a role. People were no longer as afraid of the devil or the afterlife, and they were more open to discussing their personal struggles and seeking help. The changes in Geneva during the 18th century reflect a broader shift in European society. The city's experience with suicide shows how deeply the Enlightenment and the decline of religious authority affected people's lives. It also highlights the importance of mental health and the need for support and understanding in dealing with personal crises. This period in Geneva's history is a reminder that changes in society, ideas, and attitudes can have profound effects on people's well-being. The story of Geneva's struggle with suicide is a complex one, but it offers valuable insights into the human experience. Modern researchers looking at the case of Pierre Dombre, the unemployed watchmaker who took his own life in 1787, would approach his story from different angles, each providing a unique perspective on why he might have felt driven to suicide. Let's explore how a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a sociologist might interpret Dombre's situation. A psychiatrist might focus on the letters Dombre left behind, particularly the one to the married woman he loved. In this letter, Dombre mentioned going days without eating or drinking, even though he had the means to do so. For a psychiatrist, this could suggest an organic disorder, possibly a chemical imbalance in his brain. Serotonin, a tangwaiter that affects mood, might have been at abnormally low levels in Dombre's brain, contributing to his deep depression and ultimately his decision to end his life. A psychologist, especially one with a Freudian perspective, would likely focus on Dombre's internal conflicts and emotional struggles. Dombre's difficult relationships with women, including his failed marriage and the rejection by the woman he loved, could have created a significant emotional void. Freudian theory suggests that Dombre might have concentrated all his love and desire on these women, and when both relationships failed, the emotional pain was too much to bear. The loss of love and connection might have made life seem unbearable. A sociologist, on the other hand, would look at the broader social and economic context of Dombre's life. Dombre was unemployed, living alone in a small room, and had no close relatives in Geneva. Sociologists often find a strong correlation between social isolation and suicide, especially among men. Dombre's failed marriage, lack of family support, and economic hardship all contributed to his weak social integration, making him more vulnerable to suicidal thoughts and actions. These different perspectives are not necessarily contradictory. They can be complementary. While it's possible that Dombre had a low level of serotonin, which could explain his depression, it's also important to consider the external factors that might have affected his mental state. Personal experiences like job loss or a failed marriage can indeed influence one's chemical balance. Traumatic events can stress the nervous system, leading to a depletion of cetulum and other neurotransmitters. The cultural context of early modern Geneva also played a significant role. If Dombre had lived in a society that placed less emphasis on romantic love or companionate marriage, his failures with women might not have been as devastating. The cultural shifts from the Reformation to the Enlightenment changed how people viewed marriage, family, and personal fulfillment. These changes could have made some individuals more susceptible to emotional and psychological distress. By the late 18th century, Geneva was experiencing significant social, economic, and cultural transformations. The decline of religious influence, the rise of secular values, and changes in social norms all contributed to a more individualistic and less integrated society. This environment might have made it easier for someone like Dombre to feel isolated and hopeless. Most modern researchers agree that suicide is a complex issue involving psychological, sociological, and biological factors. These factors interact in unique ways for each individual, making it difficult to pinpoint a single cause. Dombre's suicide was likely the result of a combination of his internal struggles, social isolation, and the broader cultural context of early modern Geneva. Understanding Dombre's story from these multiple perspectives helps us see the complexity of human behavior and the many factors that can lead to such a tragic outcome. Each discipline, psychiatry, psychology, and sociology, provides valuable insights that, when combined, offer a more comprehensive understanding of why Pierre Dombre might have taken his own life. In the world of history and social studies, researchers and authors have delved deep into the complex topic of suicide, exploring its historical, social, and cultural dimensions. One of the earliest and most influential works on this subject is Émile Durkheim's Suicide, a study in sociology, published in 1897. Durkheim, a French sociologist, argued that suicide is not just a personal act, but is influenced by social factors. He identified different types of suicide, such as egoistic, altruistic, and anomic, each linked to the individual's relationship with society. In the early 20th century, Jack D. Douglas expanded on Durkheim's ideas in his book, The Social Meanings of Suicide. Douglas emphasized the importance of understanding the social context and the meanings that individuals attach to their actions. He argued that suicide notes and the circumstances surrounding suicides can provide valuable insights into the social pressures and personal struggles of the individuals involved. Moving backward in time, historians have also examined the attitudes towards suicide in earlier periods. For example, in the 16th and 17th centuries, suicide was often seen as a sin and a crime. John Donne, an English poet and clergyman, wrote Biathanotes, a declaration of that paradox or thesis that self-homicide is not so naturally a sin that it may never be otherwise. This work challenged the prevailing view that suicide is always a sin, suggesting that there might be situations where it is justified. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought new perspectives on suicide. Denis Diderot and Jean Garand, D'Alembert's encyclopedia, included articles on various topics, including suicide reflecting the era's emphasis on reason and individual rights. The Enlightenment thinkers often discussed the moral and legal implications of suicide, debating whether individuals had the right to end their own lives. The 19th century saw a surge in studies on suicide, particularly in the context of industrialization and urbanization. Philippe, Henry, and James F. Short, Jr.'s Suicide and Homicide, Some Economic, Sociological, and Psychological Aspects of Aggression, explored the economic and social factors that contribute to suicide and homicide rates. They found that economic hardship and social isolation were significant factors in both phenomena. In the 20th century, the focus shifted to the psychological and biological aspects of suicide. David Lester, in his book, Why People Kill Themselves, a summary of research findings on suicidal behavior, synthesized a wide range of research, highlighting the roles of mental health, family dynamics, and biochemical factors. Lester's work, along with that of other researchers like Howard Kushner, who wrote American Suicide, a psychocultural exploration, helped to deepen our understanding of the complex interplay of factors that contribute to suicidal behavior. In more recent times, historians have also explored the gendered aspects of suicide. Sylvia Saracaneto and David Lester's edited volume, Women and Suicidal Behavior, brought together studies on the unique challenges and experiences of women in relation to suicide. They discussed how social roles, mental health, and cultural expectations influence the rates and methods of suicide among women. The study of suicide has been a multidisciplinary effort, drawing insights from sociology, psychology, history, and law. Each era and each researcher has added a layer to our understanding, revealing the deep and often hidden connections between individual actions and broader social structures. By exploring these connections, we can better understand the complex phenomena of suicide and work toward more effective prevention and support systems. The study of suicide in history has always been a complex and sensitive topic. Historians, sociologists, and psychologists have delved into the reasons why people in the past chose to end their lives. One of the most interesting periods to explore is the early modern era, particularly in places like England, France, and Switzerland. This chapter will take you through some of the key findings and insights from this period. In England, during the 17th and 18th centuries, the way people viewed suicide changed dramatically. Michael MacDonald, a historian, wrote about how suicide became more secular. Before this time, suicide was often seen as a sin and a crime, punishable by the church and the state. But as society became more modern, people started to see suicide in a different light. They began to understand that mental health issues, like depression, could lead someone to take their own life. This shift in thinking was part of a larger movement called the Enlightenment, where people started to question traditional beliefs and look for more rational explanations for human behavior. In France, historians like John McManus have looked at how attitudes toward death and suicide changed during the Enlightenment. Before this period, the Church had a strong influence on how people thought about death. But as the Enlightenment progressed, people started to see death as a natural part of life, rather than a punishment from God. This change in thinking had a big impact on how society treated those who attempted suicide. Instead of being harshly punished, they were often seen as needing help and support. In Geneva, Switzerland, the study of suicide has also revealed interesting insights. Historians like Liliane Mathieu, Weber, and Michel Porret have explored how suicide was handled in this city during the 17th and 18th centuries. Geneva was a small, tightly knit community with strong religious and social norms. The city's authorities, known as the consistory, were very strict about moral behavior. If someone attempted suicide, they would be brought before the consistory to explain their actions. These records provide a wealth of information about the personal struggles and social pressures that led people to consider ending their lives. One of the most famous cases from this period is that of Francis Spira. Spira was a young man who became deeply depressed and eventually took his own life. His story was recorded in detail, and it provides a window into the emotional and social world of early modern Geneva. Historians have used Spira's story to explore how people's identities and emotions were shaped by the religious and cultural environment around them. Another important aspect of the study of suicide in history is the role of the press. In the 18th century, the rise of newspapers and other forms of media meant that stories about suicide became more widely known. Jeffrey Merrick has written about how the press in Paris reported on suicide cases, sometimes in sensational ways. This media attention could have both positive and negative effects. On one hand, it could raise awareness about the issue and lead to more support for those in need. On the other hand, it could also contribute to a culture where suicide was seen as a dramatic and sometimes romantic act. The medical community also played a significant role in how suicide was understood. In the 16th and 17th centuries, doctors began to recognize that mental illness was a real and treatable condition. H.C. Eric Middelfort, a historian, has studied how doctors in Germany during the Renaissance treated patients with mental health issues. They often used a combination of medical treatments and religious counseling to help those who were struggling. This approach marked a shift from the earlier view that mental illness was a result of demonic possession or moral failing. Finally, the study of suicide in history also involves looking at the social and economic factors that contributed to it. In the 19th century, social scientists like Emil Durkheim began to explore how changes in society, such as urbanization and industrialization, affected suicide rates. Durkheim's famous theory of anomie suggested that when people feel disconnected from their community and lack a sense of purpose, they are more likely to consider suicide. This theory has been influential in understanding how social changes can impact mental health. Overall, the study of suicide in history is a rich and multifaceted field. It involves understanding the cultural, religious, social, and economic factors that influenced people's decisions to take their own lives. By exploring these factors, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of human behavior and the ways in which society has evolved over time. The 18th century in Geneva was a time of significant social and cultural change, which greatly influenced the lives and deaths of its people. During this period, the city underwent a transformation that affected various aspects of life, including family structures, economic conditions, and religious beliefs. One particular aspect that garnered attention was the issue of suicide, which was both a social concern and a subject of academic study. The family in 18th century Geneva was a central institution, and changes in family dynamics had profound impacts on individuals. The traditional family structure was often nuclear, consisting of parents and their children, but intergenerational ties remained strong. The nuclear family was a place of both support and conflict, and these dynamics sometimes led to tragic outcomes. For example, the death of a family member, especially a child, could be a significant source of distress and sometimes even drive a parent to suicide. This was seen in cases where parents, overwhelmed by grief, took their own lives after losing a child. Economic conditions played a crucial role in the lives of Genevans and could influence the rate of suicide. The city experienced an economic boom between 1730 and 1785, which brought prosperity to many, but also created new forms of social and economic stress. For instance, the watchmaking industry, a significant source of employment, faced periodic crises that left many workers unemployed and in financial distress. These economic downturns often led to increased rates of suicide, particularly among those who were financially vulnerable. Religious beliefs also had a significant impact on the way suicide was perceived and treated. Geneva was a stronghold of Calvinism, a Protestant tradition that emphasized the sovereignty of God and the doctrine of predestination. John Calvin, the founder of the city's religious and political system, had strong views on suicide, considering it a grave sin. This perspective influenced the legal and social responses to suicide, which were often harsh. Suicide victims were frequently denied proper burials and their goods confiscated, reflecting the belief that suicide was an act of defiance against God's will. However, as the Enlightenment began to take hold in Geneva, traditional religious views were challenged. The Enlightenment emphasized reason and individual freedom, leading to a more nuanced understanding of suicide. Some Enlightenment thinkers argued that suicide could be a rational response to unbearable suffering, and this view began to influence public opinion and legal practices. The social status of individuals in Geneva also played a role in the incidence of suicide. The city had a clear social hierarchy with citizens, citoyens, at the top, followed by native residents, natifs, and then foreigners, étrangers. Citizens were the most privileged, with full political and economic rights, while foreigners had the least. The status of an individual could affect their access to resources, social support, and the likelihood of facing economic hardship, all of which were factors in suicide. Gender differences in suicide rates were also notable. Men were more likely to commit suicide than women, and the methods they used often reflected this. Men were more likely to use firearms, which were a common and effective means of suicide. Women, on the other hand, were more likely to use poisoning or drowning. These gender differences were influenced by social norms and the availability of means. For example, women were more likely to have access to arsenic, a common poison, while men were more likely to own firearms. The legal and social responses to suicide in Geneva were shaped by both religious and secular considerations. Initially, the city's laws were heavily influenced by Calvinist doctrine, which viewed suicide as a sin and a crime. Suicide victims were often punished posthumously, with their bodies desecrated and their goods confiscated. However, as the Enlightenment progressed, these practices began to change. The decriminalization of suicide became a topic of debate, and by the end of the 18th century, there was a growing movement to treat suicide as a medical and social issue rather than a criminal one. The 18th century in Geneva was a time of significant social and cultural transformation, and these changes had a profound impact on the lives and deaths of its people. The interplay between family dynamics, economic conditions, religious beliefs, social status, and gender all contributed to the complex issue of suicide. As the city moved from a rigid Calvinist society to a more enlightened and secular one, the way suicide was understood and addressed also evolved, reflecting broader changes in society. Life in Geneva during the 18th century was marked by a complex web of social, economic, and religious factors that influenced the lives of its citizens, including their mental health and the incidence of suicide. The city, known for its strict Calvinist roots and Enlightenment ideals, was a unique setting where traditional beliefs and modern thought often clashed. One of the most striking aspects of life in Geneva was the role of religion. The city's strong Protestant heritage dating back to the Reformation deeply influenced its social fabric. The Reformed faith, which emphasized predestination and the sovereignty of God, played a significant role in shaping the attitudes of the Genevans. Despite this, the 18th century saw a gradual shift towards more secular and rational thinking, influenced by the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, who were critical of traditional religious doctrines, gained a following in Geneva, leading to a more nuanced and diverse intellectual landscape. Economic conditions also played a crucial role in the lives of Genevans. The city was a center of trade and commerce, with a significant number of merchants and artisans contributing to its economic prosperity. However, this prosperity was not evenly distributed, and many citizens faced financial hardships. The economic pressures, combined with the social and religious expectations, often led to significant stress, and in some cases, contributed to mental health issues and even suicide. Social and economic stratification was evident in the city. The natifs, or native citizens, enjoyed certain privileges and were often involved in the city's governance. The habitants, a lower social class, were more vulnerable to economic instability and had fewer rights. The tension between these groups sometimes led to social unrest and conflict. The city's guilds and professional associations, while providing a sense of community and support, also reinforced these social hierarchies. The mental health of Genevans was another critical aspect of life during this period. Melancholy, a term used to describe a range of mental health issues, was a common concern. Religious and social pressures, financial struggles, and personal tragedies often contributed to feelings of despair. The city's medical and religious authorities had differing views on how to address mental health issues, with some advocating for more compassionate and understanding approaches, while others maintained a more punitive stance. Suicide was a particularly sensitive and taboo topic in Geneva. The city's laws and religious beliefs strongly condemned suicide, and those who took their own lives faced severe penalties, including the denial of proper burial rites. However, the incidence of suicide increased during the 18th century, reflecting the growing social and economic pressures. The reasons for suicide were varied, ranging from financial difficulties and marital problems to mental health issues and personal despair. The city's authorities and the community grappled with how to respond to these tragic events, often torn between the desire to punish and the need to understand and prevent them. The role of gender in these issues is also noteworthy. Women, in particular, faced unique challenges and pressures. Marital breakdowns, domestic violence, and the lack of personal autonomy often contributed to their mental health struggles. The city's laws and social norms provided limited protection and support for women, making them more vulnerable to the stresses of life. In the context of these social, economic, and religious dynamics, the city of Geneva in the 18th century was a place of both progress and struggle. The Enlightenment ideals of reason and individualism were gradually reshaping the city's intellectual and cultural landscape, but the legacy of its Calvinist past continued to influence its social and moral fabric. The tension between these forces shaped the lives of its citizens, influencing their mental health, social status, and the tragic instances of suicide that marked this period. As we close this journey through the history of suicide, we've explored a wide range of stories and perspectives that span centuries and continents. From the ancient world to the modern era, from the bustling cities of Europe to the quiet towns of Switzerland, we've seen how suicide has been understood and dealt with in different times and places. We've learned about the influence of famous thinkers like Seneca, who saw suicide as a noble act of control over one's own life, and Voltaire, who criticized the harsh punishments for suicide. We've also delved into the lives of ordinary people, like the watchmakers of Geneva, who were disproportionately represented among those who took their own lives. Their stories show us the pressures of daily life and the struggles they faced. We've seen how different societies treated suicide. Some, like the Swiss Confederation, imposed strict laws and penalties, while others, like the English, began to view it more sympathetically. We've also looked at the impact of war, economic changes, and social pressures on suicide rates, such as the drop in suicides during times of war and the rise in suicides among certain occupations. The role of religion has been a recurring theme, from the debates of theologians in the 17th and 18th centuries to the last witch trials and executions. We've seen how religious beliefs and practices shaped attitudes toward suicide. The liberal theologians who argued for a more compassionate approach stand in contrast to the harsher views of the past. We've also explored the lives of women, who often faced unique challenges. Whether it was the pressure of unhappy marriages, the demands of work, or the stigma of rape, women's experiences have been a crucial part of this story. Throughout, we've seen how suicide is not just a personal act, but a reflection of broader social and cultural forces. The stories of individual people, from the famous to the forgotten, help us understand the complexities of this difficult topic. As we reflect on all we've learned, it's clear that the history of suicide is a story of human resilience and struggle. It reminds us of the importance of empathy, support, and understanding in our communities. By remembering the past, we can better face the challenges of the present and work toward a future where everyone feels valued and supported.